Some men didn't chase power in boardrooms or fame on TV. They chased women, in parking lots, in diners, in train stations. Between 1991 and 2000, 6 predators in America designed their lives around one thing: hunting women who trusted the wrong smile, the wrong job, the wrong stranger. They weren't the killers you've heard of. They weren't splashed across documentaries. They blended into night shifts, small towns, and forgotten corners. One offered free rides home from bars. Another posed as a fashion scout promising modeling portfolios. And one of them? He kept hair from each victim, sealed in jars, lined on his basement shelf like trophies. These are 6 of the most disturbing serial killers you've never heard of, and every one of them turned women into prey. Before we begin, tell us what country you're watching from in the comments. And please subscribe if you want more stories like this, because the cases you're about to hear, you won't find them on Netflix. In the 1990s, nightlife was supposed to mean escape. Neon lights pulsed through smoky bars, DJs spun tapes in crowded nightclubs, and young women spilled onto sidewalks in the early hours, heels in hand, laughter chasing them into the night. But in cities like Cleveland, Cincinnati, and Indianapolis, that freedom turned fatal for women who trusted the wrong ride. Between 1993 and 1998, whispers spread among bartenders and waitresses about a man who wasn't just part of the nightlife. He was embedded in it. He wasn't a flashy DJ or a bouncer towering at the door. He was smaller, quieter, dressed in black work clothes and hauling crates of liquor behind the counter. He was a barback, the invisible worker who stocked ice, swept floors, and made the party possible. To the drunks stumbling out at closing time, he looked helpful, harmless, even kind. That was his disguise. Later, when investigators pieced his case together, they called him the Barback Killer. His real name was Darren Holt, a 32-year-old with no criminal record and a resume of odd jobs that kept him circling through the bar scene. Why did he kill? Detectives who studied his case later concluded that Holt fed on resentment. Women in the bars looked past him every night. They laughed with bartenders, flirted with DJs, clung to bouncers when fights broke out. But the barback? He was invisible. That invisibility grew into fury. Killing for Holt wasn't about lust or money. It was about reclaiming control from the women who overlooked him, and his hunting ground gave him everything he needed. Women intoxicated, isolated, desperate for safe passage home. His lure was devastatingly simple. After closing time, he loaded empty bottles into crates by the back door, always keeping an eye on who left alone. A staggering woman waiting by herself on the curb, a college student separated from her friends, a waitress walking to her car at the far end of the lot. Holt would step out of the shadows, keys jingling in hand, and offer, "I'm heading your way, safer than calling a cab at this hour." To women in the haze of 2 a.m., the offer sounded like salvation. Cab lines stretched for blocks, friends were gone, wallets were thin. And here was a worker from inside the bar, someone recognizable, someone trusted. They got in his car. They never stepped out alive. Holt's weapon of choice was rope, always kept neatly coiled in the trunk alongside cleaning supplies. Some nights he used duct tape, others a bar towel knotted tightly around a wrist or throat. He avoided knives and guns, too messy, too loud. He preferred silence, control, and routine. Every kill followed the same pattern. He drove down side streets first, chatting calmly to ease suspicion. Then he turned off into industrial lots, half-empty warehouses, or fields on the city's edge. Once parked, the rope slipped around a neck or wrists. His victims rarely had time to scream. And Holt? He never raised his voice. Survivors, the rare few who managed to leap from his car before the rope tightened, said his calmness was worse than rage. He spoke like he was still on shift, his tone flat, instructions clipped. Don't fight. It'll be easier. But what made him especially dangerous wasn't just the calm. It was his invisibility. Nobody remembered the barback. Managers rotated them constantly. Patrons never learned their names. Women remembered the DJ, the bartender, the bouncer, never the man hauling ice behind the scenes. That anonymity gave Holt cover for nearly 5 years. By the time police connected missing women across multiple clubs, the predator had already melted into another city, another bar, another back door. For nearly 5 years, Darren Holt worked the shadows of nightlife and erased his victims with equal precision. His disposal methods were as routine as his kills. He didn't bury bodies deep in woods or dump them in rivers. That would leave questions when hikers or fishermen stumbled across them. Instead, Holt used the very infrastructure of the city itself. Victims were often left in abandoned warehouses, their bodies concealed under discarded tarps and boxes. Some were placed in industrial dumpsters behind shuttered factories, hidden among broken glass and splintered wood. Others were left in vacant lots where weeds grew high, certain to be overlooked until the stench forced discovery weeks later. He counted on urban decay to swallow what he left behind, and for years, it worked. Missing person reports piled up, but with women vanishing from different bars, different counties, and different states, police couldn't connect the dots. To investigators, these women were casualties of city nightlife, strangers lost to the chaos of the night. To Holt, they were trophies of control. But control has limits. The first cracks in his ritual appeared in 1997, when a sanitation worker discovered a woman's body inside a dumpster, still wrapped in bar towels from the club she'd last been seen at. Detectives traced the towels back to a downtown nightclub and began questioning staff. Holt, working as a barback that week, gave an alibi. He said he'd left early, gone home to sleep. Nobody doubted him. After all, who remembered the barback? But police filed his name. It wouldn't be the last time. Months later, a second victim was found in a vacant lot, a thin strip of rope embedded in her skin. That rope was traced back to the same hardware supplier used by multiple clubs, and again, on shift logs, the name appeared: Darren Holt. The final break came in 1998 when a woman managed to escape. She had accepted Holt's offer of a ride home, but threw herself from his car when he slowed for a stop sign. Bruised and bleeding, she crawled into a nearby gas station, where she told attendants about the barback who offered her safety, then tried to kill her. Police matched her account to prior cases. Forensic teams searched Holt's car and found fibers from the same bar towels used in multiple clubs. Rope from his trunk matched ligature marks on victims. Most damning of all, investigators found earrings, bracelets, and small personal items hidden in his apartment. Not jewelry for pleasure, but trophies he had kept from each kill. At trial, prosecutors called him the man nobody noticed. They described how he used invisibility as camouflage, how his position as a low-level worker gave him access without suspicion. Jurors were shown photographs of the dumpsters, warehouses, and lots where bodies had been found. They listened to the survivor recount Holt's calm voice as he slipped rope around her neck. It was enough. Holt was convicted of multiple counts of murder and sentenced to life without parole. He never confessed, never explained, never broke the flat, detached demeanor he carried behind the bar. For women in the Midwest, his case was a warning etched in memory. Bartenders began escorting waitresses to cars after closing. Clubs installed cameras near staff exits. Friends refused to leave one another behind. The barback killer had taught them the cost of trust, that sometimes the man offering safety from the chaos of the night was the danger all along. If Holt used dim parking lots and false kindness to trap women leaving bars, the next predator used bright lights and promises of glamour, posing as a photographer who never delivered portfolios. In the late 1990s, the modeling craze swept through America's malls, colleges, and city sidewalks. Agencies promised fame, magazines promised glamour, and photographers lurked everywhere, dangling dreams in exchange for trust. It was an era of glossy headshots, talent scouts setting up booths in shopping centers, and casting calls advertised on corkboards. For ambitious young women, the possibility of being discovered felt real, and it was in that environment that a predator found his perfect disguise. He didn't need a weapon to lure his victims. He used a camera. His name was Martin Greaves, though no one knew it until it was too late. Women who met him called him Mark, the photographer who promised portfolios, who offered free sessions, who claimed he had connections in New York. But in reality, he wasn't shooting fashion. He was hunting women. Later, when investigators pieced his crimes together, they gave him a name that stuck: the photography predator. Why did he kill? Detectives later argued it was about control dressed as glamour. Greaves had tried and failed to become a photographer in the legitimate sense. He had portfolios filled with blurry landscapes, magazines full of clippings he'd never shot, and a bitterness toward the industry that had rejected him. Instead of chasing art, he turned rejection into revenge. Women who trusted him became surrogates for a world that overlooked him. Killing wasn't random. It was a performance. Each victim was part of a ritual where he controlled the pose, the backdrop, the outcome. His lure was perfect for the times. He carried flyers printed with promises of free professional photo sessions and left them in coffee shops, libraries, and campuses. He rented cheap cameras, carried a leather portfolio case, and spoke the language of fashion well enough to sound convincing. The women he approached were often students, waitresses, or cashiers. Ordinary women with no modeling background who believed his pitch. "You've got the look. Ever thought about modeling? I can do your starter shots for free." He made it sound like a gift. Many agreed to meet him in studios he claimed to rent. In truth, the studios were abandoned warehouses, storage units, or motel rooms dressed up with cheap backdrops and lights he borrowed or stole. Once inside, the doors locked, the trust evaporated, and Greaves revealed his true intent. His weapons were as practical as they were terrifying. He carried a tripod, heavy enough to be swung like a club. He carried duct tape disguised as equipment tape, useful for binding wrists. Most chilling was his use of scarves and ties, props he presented as part of the shoot. Victims believed they were modeling accessories until they tightened around their throats. Greaves didn't kill in rage or panic. He killed as if staging scenes, positioning bodies against walls, draping fabric as if they were still props. Survivors, there were only 2, said he never yelled, never cursed. He directed them the way a photographer would direct a model. Turn your head, stay still, hold it. Only later did they realize those commands weren't for a camera. They were for control. What made him especially difficult to catch was how ordinary he looked. Greaves dressed in khakis and button-down shirts, carried disposable cameras in his bag, and spoke softly with rehearsed confidence. Women who met him often remembered only fragments. He seemed professional. He carried a portfolio. He talked about agencies. That vagueness kept him untouchable for years. Police saw the missing women, but in a decade filled with transient lifestyles and dreams of fame, they had no reason to link them to the man with a camera who always walked away unseen. For years, Martin Greaves managed to make women vanish as smoothly as he lured them. His disposal methods reflected the same cold calculation he used in his lures. Unlike impulsive predators, he didn't dump bodies randomly, he staged them. Victims were often left in places that could pass as accidents or disappearances, chosen to delay suspicion. Some were abandoned in motel rooms, posed neatly on beds with their belongings arranged as if they had simply checked out of life. Others were placed near bus terminals with purses still intact, making police initially assume they had overdosed or run away. The most haunting sites were storage units Greaves rented under false names, where victims were hidden behind false walls built from plywood and draped with backdrops. He even locked some inside wardrobes, leaving them as if frozen in a grotesque display. To him, the disposal wasn't about erasing evidence, it was about finishing the performance. But even performances leave mistakes. In 1997, construction workers clearing an abandoned warehouse near Louisville stumbled on a scene that didn't belong. A makeshift backdrop leaned against the wall, and behind it lay the body of a missing college student, bound with scarves tied in knots identical to those used in Greaves's shoots. Next to her body was a crushed disposable camera, its film too damaged to reveal images, but enough to link to a local rental store. Detectives began pulling at threads, tracing camera rentals, storage unit contracts, and witness sightings of a photographer handing out flyers. Piece by piece, the profile sharpened. The predator wasn't a professional at all. He was a fraud using the illusion of photography to control women who trusted him. The evidence trail accelerated when another victim's remains were discovered in a storage facility. Investigators found Greaves's ledger, a notebook where he had scribbled initials, dates, and vague notes like blue dress, perfect pose, or struggled, but quiet now. That notebook became the key. Forensic teams matched fibers from scarves, fingerprints on duct tape, and DNA from cigarette butts left in motel ashtrays. The walls of deception collapsed quickly. By 1999, Greaves was tracked to a rented apartment filled with photography magazines, stacks of disposable cameras, and boxes containing trophies, jewelry, hairbrushes, even Polaroids he had taken before his victims disappeared. At trial, prosecutors painted him not as a failed photographer, but as a predator who used glamour as bait. Survivors testified about his calm voice, the way he directed them like models until fear set in. Jurors were shown the ledger, the scarves, the duct tape, the broken cameras. The verdict was inevitable. Guilty on multiple counts of murder, with more suspected victims than the state could prove. Greaves was sentenced to life without parole, his studio closed forever. He never confessed, never admitted how many women he had lured with promises of fame. His silence left families with more questions than answers. But here's what's chilling. Even after his conviction, flyers offering free portfolio shoots continued to circulate in coffee shops for years. Investigators believe some were left behind deliberately, planted as decoys to taunt police. Others might have been copycats inspired by the case. Either way, the fear lingered. For young women, the photography predator became a warning etched in memory, that the wrong smile and the wrong offer could turn dreams of glamour into nightmares of disappearance. If Greaves used cameras and promises of glamour to lure women, the next killer used commuter trains. He didn't dangle fame, he waited for women traveling alone, trapped in empty platforms. The 1990s were a golden age of American commuting. Cities like Chicago, New York, and Boston saw thousands of women traveling daily for work or school, moving through stations where footsteps echoed against tile and fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. These spaces were meant to feel secure, crowded in the day, patrolled by transit cops at night. But in the shadows of empty platforms and dimly lit bathrooms, a predator watched the flow of women who trusted the system to keep them safe. His real name was Harold Cray, but among investigators who later connected the cases, he was called the commuter stalker. His hunting ground wasn't alleys or highways. It was the everyday pulse of commuter trains. Why did he kill? Detectives later argued it wasn't rage in the moment, but years of bitterness that boiled into obsession. Cray had once been a conductor's assistant in Boston, fired for harassment complaints in the late 1980s. That rejection grew into hatred for the women who moved freely in a world that had shut him out. He returned to train stations not as a worker, but as a predator. He understood schedules, blind spots, and which exits went unwatched. To him, stations were no longer places of travel. They were hunting grounds disguised as infrastructure. His lure was simple but deadly. Wearing a jacket that resembled a transit uniform, Cray approached women waiting alone on platforms late at night. He'd say things like, "This train's been rerouted, let me show you the safer exit." Or, "Bathrooms upstairs are closed, but I can unlock the staff restroom." Most women, tired after long shifts, accepted the help. They followed him through service doors, down stairwells, or into unlit corridors. Once isolated, the disguise dropped. Cray's voice changed. The tone shifted from authority to command. What began as trust turned instantly into terror. Weapons were never elaborate. He carried a steel flashlight heavy enough to double as a club. He kept a roll of duct tape tucked into his jacket pocket, claiming it was for repairs. He also carried zip ties stolen from maintenance rooms. They were efficient, silent, and unnoticed if someone searched his pockets. Cray avoided firearms, too noisy for echoing stations. He avoided knives unless necessary, preferring blunt force and restraint. His attacks were rehearsed, almost professional, as if every movement had been practiced in the same corridors he once swept as an employee. Survivors said he never hesitated, never showed panic, and spoke in low, monotone commands. "Sit down. Don't scream. Stay still." The familiarity of the surroundings made his victims trust him first, and fear him only when it was too late. What made him especially dangerous was how well he understood the rhythm of the system. He struck on nights when the last train had already pulled out, when attendants were gone, and janitors had clocked out. Platforms were silent, corridors were deserted. Cameras in the 1990s were grainy and easy to avoid. Cray knew which ones were broken, which ones had blind spots, which stairwells echoed too loudly to risk. He didn't just hunt in stations, he owned them. Women who trusted his uniform walked straight into the trap he built, never realizing that the commuter system that promised safety had birthed its own predator. Harold Cray thought train stations were the perfect place to make women vanish because the system itself covered his tracks. His disposal methods weren't sophisticated in the traditional sense. They were opportunistic, designed to exploit the constant churn of commuters. Some victims were dragged into mechanical rooms, their bodies hidden behind supply racks until the smell forced discovery weeks later. Others were left in construction zones sealed off for renovations, their remains mixed with debris as crews unknowingly poured fresh cement over evidence. But most haunting of all were the women found in tunnels just beyond the stations, concealed in alcoves where utility pipes ran. Cray knew security officers rarely ventured that far. To him, those tunnels were graves dug not by shovels, but by the infrastructure of the city itself. For years, disappearances were dismissed as runaways or accidents. After all, cities in the 1990s saw constant turnover of commuters. If a woman didn't come home, she was often assumed to have fled or been lost to unrelated crime. That worked in Cray's favor. But what he didn't anticipate was consistency. And consistency breeds suspicion. Each recovered body carried the same signs: ligature marks from zip ties, bruising from blunt strikes with a cylindrical object, and traces of industrial tape. Detectives reviewing cases across multiple transit systems realized the overlap. Women weren't vanishing randomly. They were being stalked and silenced in the same ritual. The first real break came when transit police in Boston discovered a victim hidden in a locked staff restroom. Alongside the body lay a flashlight with worn grips. Forensic testing revealed partial fingerprints, faint but enough to trace back to Harold Cray, a former employee who had been dismissed nearly a decade earlier. Detectives reopened his personnel file, finding complaints from women who had once accused him of harassment, notes about his unusual familiarity with restricted areas, and his termination after repeated violations. Suddenly, the phantom stalking stations wasn't a phantom at all. He was a man the system itself had once employed. Investigators placed Cray under surveillance. They watched him loiter near platforms long after trains departed, slipping into stairwells with practiced ease. One night in 1999, undercover officers followed him as he led a young woman through a staff exit. He never made it out. Police intercepted him mid-attack, duct tape already in hand. His arrest ended years of fear that had rippled through multiple cities. At trial, prosecutors presented the case not as a collection of random killings, but as a systematic abuse of knowledge. They laid out maps of stations, marked blind spots, and demonstrated how Cray exploited them. Survivors testified about his calm, commanding tone, the way he made his lies sound like official instructions. Jurors took less than 2 days. Cray was convicted on multiple counts of murder and sentenced to life without parole. Even behind bars, his case left scars. Commuter authorities nationwide were forced to reassess safety protocols. Cameras were upgraded, staff-only areas secured, and women warned never to follow anyone without verified ID. The commuter stalker had turned America's train stations into his hunting ground, and though he was caged, his crimes served as a lasting reminder. Not every uniform means protection, and not every exit is safe. If Cray used train stations as cages, the next killer used something far more personal. He found women in laundromats, offered free dryers, and lured them into a basement no one escaped. The hum of laundromats in the 1990s was part of American suburbia's background noise. Rows of machines spinning clothes, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, and the smell of detergent thick in the air made them feel safe, even dull. They were places where women went alone after work, often at night, carrying baskets of clothes and pockets of quarters. No one expected danger between dryers and folding tables. But in a small stretch of Ohio and Pennsylvania between 1994 and 1999, a predator turned laundromats into his trap. His name was Timothy Rourke, but investigators would later give him a darker title, the basement groomer. He didn't stalk alleys or clubs. He hunted in places where women thought only of clean laundry, and he groomed his victims with something as harmless as a smile and an offer of help. Why did he kill? Detectives later suggested Rourke's crimes were born from decades of resentment. He had grown up poor, bullied and ridiculed for smelling of unwashed clothes when his family couldn't afford laundry machines. Those humiliations twisted into an obsession with laundromats, places that represented both his shame and his power. Working as a part-time handyman, Rourke had access to multiple laundromats across small towns. He knew which ones had broken locks on back doors, which ones had cameras that hadn't worked in years, and which ones attracted women who came late at night. He killed not for lust or money, but for dominance, to reclaim power over the very spaces where he had once felt powerless. His lure was chillingly ordinary. He would strike up conversations with women folding clothes, presenting himself as helpful, soft-spoken, even charming. Sometimes he offered to carry baskets to their cars. Other times, he claimed the dryers were broken and suggested using a free machine in the basement, a perk for regular customers, he'd say. That basement was his hunting ground. Most women followed without hesitation. After all, who suspects the handyman with keys, the man everyone sees fixing coin slots or mopping up leaks? Once they descended those steps, the door locked and the laundromat above kept humming, drowning out any chance of their voices being heard. His weapons were tools of maintenance, a wrench tucked into his belt, electrical cords coiled and ready, cleaning rags that could double as restraints. Victims never expected them to become instruments of control because they were objects of repair, not violence. Survivors, only one escaped, recalled how Rourke never raised his voice. He spoke like a teacher correcting a mistake, instructing every move with eerie calm. Sit down. Don't move. Hands here. He didn't strike in rage, but in rehearsed precision, as if every act was part of a routine he had perfected. His confidence came from knowing the space belonged to him. Above, machines spun endlessly. Below, in the dim basement light, he ruled without interruption. What made him especially dangerous was his ability to blend into the routine of the laundromat itself. Customers remembered a handyman, nothing more. Managers saw a quiet worker who fixed machines and cleaned floors. Nobody remembered his name, only that he was around. That invisibility kept him operating for 5 years, turning laundromats into traps where women thought only about finishing chores, never realizing that the man offering free dryers was grooming them for something far darker. For years, Timothy Rourke believed the basements beneath laundromats would keep his secrets buried. They weren't vast spaces, just low-ceilinged utility rooms lined with boilers, water pipes, and stacks of detergent. But to him, they were vaults, places no customer ever saw and no inspector checked often. His disposal method reflected the same utilitarian mindset as his kills. Victims were often concealed temporarily behind plywood panels he installed himself, disguised as maintenance repairs. Others were stuffed into industrial carts, wheeled out through back alleys at night, and loaded into his van under piles of broken machine parts. From there, he dumped bodies into abandoned drainage tunnels outside town or shallow pits along wooded roads. He didn't bury deep, didn't bother with elaborate disguises. He counted on 2 things: time and apathy. Missing women from laundromats were easily dismissed as runaways, drifters, or wives who had walked away from families. And in the 1990s, police databases were far less connected. His crimes fell between jurisdictions, each disappearance chalked up as an isolated tragedy. But even routines leave cracks. In 1997, a laundromat owner hired new contractors to replace old boilers. When workers tore down a section of plywood, they uncovered something that didn't belong: scraps of fabric wrapped around human bones. Investigators were called, and suddenly a place once associated with detergent and dryers became a crime scene. Forensic teams combed the basement and found electrical cords tied in knots, duct tape with partial fingerprints, and stains hidden beneath layers of paint. A chilling pattern emerged when detectives cross-checked missing person reports. Every woman had last been seen carrying laundry baskets into one of 3 laundromats where Rourke worked. Still, he might have slipped away if not for his arrogance. Rourke had kept trophies. In his basement apartment, investigators later discovered shoelaces, hair clips, and small pieces of jewelry stored in jars, each labeled with dates. Alongside them lay receipts from hardware stores, proving his purchases of plywood, paint, and locks. The jars were his downfall. Forensic testing matched hair samples inside them to the remains found beneath the laundromat. Detectives finally had a direct link tying the handyman to the women who had vanished. In 1999, police placed Rourke under surveillance. They watched him linger at laundromats long after closing, unlocking doors with keys no one else carried. One night, they followed him as he tried to lure another woman with his free dryer trick. This time, plainclothes officers intercepted him before she stepped into the basement. Rourke was arrested on the spot. At trial, prosecutors called him a predator who turned chores into traps. Jurors listened as survivors described the calm, teacher-like voice that made them follow orders before fear even set in. They saw the jars, the receipts, the ropes. The verdict was swift. Guilty on multiple counts of murder, sentenced to life without parole. But the scars lingered. Families refused to visit laundromats alone. Owners tore out basements, reinforced locks, and installed cameras. Mothers warned daughters never to accept help from anyone, not even the man fixing the machines. Rourke had shown that danger didn't always come from dark alleys. Sometimes it waited under buzzing fluorescent lights, wearing a maintenance uniform, holding a set of keys. If Rourke used laundromat basements as prisons, the next predator found his cage inside shopping malls, posing as security, isolating women in staff corridors, and turning consumer temples into hunting grounds. Shopping malls in the 1990s were cathedrals of consumer life. Families wandered food courts, teenagers clustered around arcades, and women drifted through department stores under the soft glow of escalator lights. They were places meant to feel safe, buzzing with security guards, cameras, and the illusion that crowds guaranteed protection. But between 1993 and 1999, a predator stalked women in Midwestern malls, hiding in the very system meant to guard them. His real name was Paul Denton, though women who survived called him something else, the mall predator. Unlike the lurkers in parking lots, Denton didn't strike from the shadows outside. He hunted inside, wearing the uniform of safety itself. He posed as mall security. But why did he kill? Detectives later argued it was resentment disguised as duty. Denton had once applied to be a real police officer, but failed psychological exams that flagged him as unstable. That rejection festered into an obsession with power and control. He took a job as a night shift security guard at a mall in Ohio, where he quickly learned the rhythms of shoppers, who stayed late, who came alone, who lingered near exits after stores closed. For Denton, killing women wasn't about impulse. It was about proving he had authority, control, and the ability to turn a space of safety into his private stage. His lure was calculated and terrifyingly effective. Dressed in a second-hand security jacket, carrying a flashlight and a ring of fake keys, he approached women near closing time with the same line. "Ma'am, we've had thefts in the area. I need to check your bags in the staff corridor." Sometimes he claimed there were reports of suspicious men in the parking lot and offered to escort them through back hallways for safety. The uniform, the calm voice, the plastic badge. It was enough to dissolve doubt. Women followed him through staff doors into narrow, deserted corridors behind storefronts. Once inside, Denton locked the doors, the fluorescent buzz replaced by silence. His weapons were simple, concealed among his props. A heavy Maglite flashlight, perfect for striking. Zip ties clipped to his belt under the pretense of crowd control. A length of nylon cord tucked into his pocket. He didn't brandish them immediately. He waited until the doors were shut and the echo of footsteps vanished into empty service hallways. Then the performance shifted. The smile dropped. The voice turned cold. Survivors later testified that he spoke with the authority of a man delivering orders. "Hands behind your back. Don't speak. It'll be easier this way." He didn't scream, didn't rush. He was calm, methodical, and frighteningly professional. What made him so dangerous was the environment itself. Malls were labyrinths of back hallways, service doors, and blind spots where cameras didn't reach. Denton knew every one of them. He chose hallways with double exits, janitor closets with deadbolts, and maintenance shafts no shopper would ever see. He used the very architecture of safety to isolate his victims. And for years, nobody suspected. Women vanished from malls, their cars left untouched in parking lots, their purses and purchases abandoned on benches. To investigators, it looked like random disappearances. To Denton, it was a ritual played out under the cover of escalator lights and background music. Paul Denton believed the labyrinth of malls would keep his secrets buried forever. The The service corridors where he cornered women were only the beginning of his ritual. Disposal was as calculated as the lure itself. Victims were often hidden in janitorial closets until the mall emptied out completely. Then Denton wheeled them through back passages in supply carts draped with trash bags, blending in with the routine of nightly cleanup. To employees still present, he looked like just another guard helping staff. No one questioned the man in uniform moving bags of trash. Once outside, he loaded the carts into his pickup and drove into the industrial outskirts of town. Some women were left in abandoned warehouses near loading docks, their bodies concealed under discarded mannequins and fixtures from shuttered stores. Others were dumped in overgrown fields near construction sites, where bulldozers would eventually churn the ground. He counted on urban sprawl to bury his crimes, and for years it did. But routine can betray even the most careful predator. Investigators began connecting disappearances when they noticed a chilling pattern. Many of the women had last been seen inside malls where Denton worked shifts, though his name often appeared only on temporary logs. It wasn't until 1998 that the first solid break came. A cleaning crew at a shuttered department store found a locked storage closet that smelled foul. Inside, they discovered the remains of a woman wrapped in shopping bags tied with nylon cord, the same type carried by mall security for crowd control. Forensic teams collected fibers, fingerprints, and trace evidence. Denton's prints were faint but present, pressed against the duct tape sealing the bags. Detectives placed Denton under surveillance. They watched him linger near mall exits after closing, watched him follow lone women through staff corridors, always carrying his flashlight and ring of keys. His arrest came after one woman resisted. Denton had cornered her near a service door, but her screams drew the attention of real security guards. He fled, but police intercepted him in the parking lot. In his trunk, investigators found zip ties, duct tape, and jewelry traced back to multiple missing women. Most damning was a collection of store receipts and security badges stolen from various malls, allowing him to pose as staff across state lines. At trial, prosecutors laid bare the architecture of his crimes. They showed jurors blueprints of malls, highlighting the hidden corridors and blind spots Denton exploited. Survivors testified about his calm tone, the cold authority in his voice, the way he spoke like a man delivering orders rather than committing crimes. The evidence was overwhelming. Denton was convicted on multiple counts of murder and sentenced to life without parole. For families, the horror lingered. Malls remodeled their corridors, added cameras, and trained guards to verify IDs. But shoppers never forgot that the man meant to keep them safe was the predator all along. Denton turned temples of consumer life into his hunting ground, and though he was caged, his crimes left a permanent crack in the illusion of safety. If Denton used uniforms and corridors to trap women, the next killer used something far stranger. He didn't take jewelry or purses. He took hair, sealing it in jars like trophies. In the late 1990s, when police finally pieced his crimes together, they struggled to name him. Some called him the Motel Strangler, others the Trophy Keeper. But the nickname that stuck, whispered in newspapers and courtroom transcripts, was the Hair Collector. Unlike other killers who stole jewelry, clothes, or purses, this man's obsession was singular: women's hair. Every victim was marked by the same grotesque ritual. Strands cut, locks severed, and jars filled, lined on his basement shelves as if he were building a museum of the women he destroyed. His real name was Leonard Price, a middle-aged drifter who floated between motels in Kentucky, Tennessee, and Ohio. To motel owners, he looked like another quiet tenant, someone who paid in cash, stayed a week, and moved on. To the women he targeted, he looked helpful, polite, and disarmingly ordinary. But to the investigators who would later dig into his basement, He was something else entirely, a predator who collected pieces of the women he erased. Why did he kill? Detectives and psychologists later argued it was about obsession with permanence. Price had been abandoned young by his mother, a woman who left him in foster care without explanation. That rejection calcified into rage, but also into fixation. Hair to him symbolized identity, something beautiful, something lasting even after death. By cutting and preserving it, he believed he kept control of the women forever, even when their bodies were gone. Every killing was staged around this ritual. He didn't chase women in alleys or bars. He lured them in with the false promise of safety. Price's hunting grounds were motels along interstates, places where travelers stopped alone, often late at night. He'd strike up conversations in lobbies or vending machine rooms, offering to carry bags, fix broken locks, or share a drink. His tone was gentle, his frame unthreatening. Women trusted him enough to let him into their rooms. Once the door closed, the ritual began. His weapons were basic but effective. Price carried nylon rope in his duffel, duct tape tucked inside toiletry kits, and scissors hidden in his coat. He preferred strangulation, a silent method that left him in control until the very end. Survivors, there were only 2, recalled how he spoke softly, almost tenderly, even as he tied wrists and pressed rope against their throats. The scissors always came after death. He'd place the body on the motel bed, brush the victim's hair with slow strokes, then cut locks and place them carefully in jars he carried wrapped in towels. The jars were labeled later with dates, motel names, and initials. This ritual was his signature, the one detail that would eventually lead detectives to connect cases across 3 states. What made Price especially terrifying was how ordinary he appeared. Motel clerks remembered him as quiet, the kind of man who never made trouble. Women described him as soft-spoken, the type you might accept help from without hesitation. His ordinariness was his camouflage, and for nearly a decade, it worked. Women vanished from motels, their cars still in lots, their belongings untouched. Investigators dismissed them as runaways, drifters, or cases of domestic violence. Nobody imagined a man in a cheap coat, renting rooms by the week, was cutting and collecting hair as trophies in a basement no one thought to search. Leonard Price's murders were built around ritual, but his disposal methods were built around disappearance. He didn't want attention drawn to the women's bodies. He wanted the hair in his jars to be the only proof they had ever existed. That meant keeping their remains away from discovery as long as possible. Some victims were dragged into wooded areas behind motels, buried in shallow pits, covered with leaves and trash. Others were stuffed into drainage culverts near highways, where the constant water flow eroded evidence before police could connect dots. In at least 3 cases, Price transported bodies in his duffel bag, moving them across county lines and dumping them in quarries or old construction sites. Each time, he left with the same prize, a jar of hair sealed tightly and stored on his basement shelves. To investigators, the disposal looked chaotic, random. To Price, it was secondary. The ritual was the cut. The trophies were what mattered. But even rituals leave trails. The first major break came in 1998, when road workers near Bowling Green discovered bones in a culvert. Among the remains was duct tape imprinted with faint fingerprints. Analysts matched them to Price, who had been fingerprinted years earlier for petty theft. At the time, it wasn't enough to arrest him, but detectives flagged his name. Months later, when another body surfaced near a quarry in Kentucky, again bound with duct tape, again with strands of hair cut clean from the scalp, investigators finally saw the link. They cross-checked motel records and found Price's name repeated at multiple locations where women had vanished. Still, they needed proof of ritual, and that proof came from inside his home. In 1999, police raided the basement of Price's rented house. What they found turned suspicion into certainty. Shelves lined the walls, stacked with glass jars, each sealed and labeled with dates and motel names. Inside were locks of hair, some long, some short, each preserved like grotesque trophies. Beside them were notebooks filled with sketches of hairstyles and initials of women. Investigators also recovered scissors, ropes, and rolls of duct tape, all bearing traces of DNA. The jars became the most damning evidence. They showed not only intent, but obsession, tying him directly to victims whose bodies had already been recovered. At trial, prosecutors didn't just present him as a killer. They framed him as a collector, a man who turned women into objects cataloged in glass. Jurors saw photographs of the jars, the dates scrawled in Price's handwriting, the chilling precision of his system. Survivors testified about his calm demeanor, his soft voice, the scissors that appeared after the rope went tight. Families of victims sat in court, staring at the jars that had held pieces of their daughters. The verdict was swift: guilty on multiple counts of murder, sentenced to life without parole. Price never confessed. Even in prison, he refused to explain why hair mattered to him, why he cataloged victims like artifacts. But psychologists argued the jars were his way of rewriting abandonment, of controlling women forever by preserving the one part of them he believed could never die. To investigators, the case became a haunting reminder. Predators don't always chase money or lust. Sometimes they chase rituals that make sense only to them. 6 killers, 6 hunting grounds, 6 ways ordinary life became lethal. The barback killer who offered women safe rides home, but turned his car into a coffin. The photography predator who promised glamour, but staged scenes of death. The commuter stalker who used train stations as cages. The basement groomer who turned laundromats into prisons. The mall predator who hid behind uniforms and corridors. And the hair collector who preserved women not as memories but as trophies in jars. They weren't legends, they weren't myths. They were ordinary men in ordinary places: barbacks, photographers, handymen, guards, drifters. Each found a way to turn routine into ritual, trust into traps, and safety into silence.